Welcome. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, I'm really excited that Ashley Vass from Nature Saskatchewan will be speaking about piping plovers and also giving us an update about the recent piping plover census. Before we begin, I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we begin, I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with prairie conservation or species at risk. And I'd like to invite everyone to join us for a webinar on March 4th about whooping cranes by the International Crane Foundation. And we'll also be hosting the Prairie's Got the Goods Week from March 10th to 14th. And it's about all the benefits, ecological goods, and services provided by the Native Prairie ecosystem. And you can register for all of these webinars on the PCAP website. Also, most of our past webinar presentations have been recorded and can now be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded there in the near future as well. And to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the webinar, at any time, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard. If you're on a cell phone, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. You're also welcome to upvote other people's questions if you have the same one, or answer other people's questions too if you know the answer. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel. In-kind support has been provided by Nature Saskatchewan. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce today's presenter, Ashley. Ashley Vass received her Master's in Science in Biology from the University of Regina and has been working with Saskatchewan Species at Risk since 2008. She's been with Nature Saskatchewan working with the Stewards of Saskatchewan programs for over a decade, including work with the Plovers Onshore program. This year, she took a brief hiatus from her permanent role as a Habitat Stewardship Coordinator for the Rare Plant Rescue Program to coordinate the Prairie Canada Piping Plover Census in partnership with the Canadian Wildlife Survey. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Ashley.
Great. Just share my screen here. Thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Not yet, but let me see here. Yes, there it goes. Good to go, Ashley.
Okay, awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Caitlin. I think I'll just turn off my video just because I have some videos that I'm going to show in the presentation, and I want to make sure that they get all the bandwidth that they need. But I'll come back on at the end for the question period. Okay, so yeah, again, thank you so much for the introduction, Caitlin, and thanks so much everybody for taking the time to come to the presentation today and learn a bit about piping plovers and the Prairie Canada Piping Plover Census results. I started at Nature Saskatchewan in 2014, January actually, and one of my first roles there was Habitat Stewardship Coordinator for the Plovers Onshore program. So I definitely have some love for the plovers. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about that a bit today. What we're gonna go over, if I can get that. Okay, yeah, so I know like PCAP has these Native Prairie Speaker Series have a wide range of audiences from children all the way up to experts. So I'm gonna try and cover a bit of a variety today so that hopefully everybody can go home and learn something after this presentation. And I'll also just mention that we're really grateful for sometimes the children will actually draw pictures of the species that we're talking about and email those to us, and we really appreciate that. So, keep that up. So first of all, I'm just gonna, basically quickly talk about everything you'd need to know about piping plovers. So we'll cover what is a piping plover. We'll go over their identification and some tricky lookalikes. I'll talk a bit about their behavior. And then we'll also look at some pictures of nests and young. I'll touch on their life cycle, and we'll discuss their preferred habitat and their status and distribution. And then I'm going to get into just sort of a brief history of the International Piping Plover Census. We'll discuss the Prairie Canada Piping Plover Census that we just did last year, and I'll go over the results of that. And then I'll end with just discussing some of the threats to piping plovers and things that you could do to help them. So first of all, what is a piping plover? So piping plovers are small migratory shorebirds. They're endemic to North America, so they're only found here. They breed on sparsely vegetated beaches, so they do require water. And they also feed on aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates like spiders, beetles, worms, things like that, mostly at the water's edge. They're a really round, stocky bird that have these big eyes and a very stubby bill. The males and females are very similar. So there is not a lot of sexual dimorphism in this species. So it's hard to tell those apart. And they also camouflage super well. So it's also very hard to find them. Okay, so I said they're small. Well, what's small mean, you know? So I'm just showing you some pictures here that show piping plovers, you know, in relative to some other object. So there's a surveyor, piping plovers flying by. There's a piping plover that's sort of nestled down next to a coffee cup. And then in the bottom right is a picture of me taking a picture of a piping plover. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how small they really are. They're about 7.5 inches from the tip of their tail to the tip of their beak. Okay, so if I see a really small shorebird, you know, how do I know whether or not it's a piping plover? Well, there's actually a lot of really good identification characteristics to help you figure out that it is a piping plover. So first of all, they have this white belly and a pale gray back. It's been described as like a tan or a sand, like the color of dry sand, which also helps them with camouflage. Then they have a black headband that goes from one eye across their forehead to the other eye and a single black neckband. They have orange legs, and then, as I mentioned, a stubby, sort of stout beak that's orange with a black tip. They also have a yellow eye ring, so whether or not you're able to actually see that, you know, it is a characteristic of piping plovers, and it does help you identify them when compared to, say, a killdeer. Oh, a really fun fact about piping plovers is that they have this tridactyl foot arrangement. So they actually only have 3 toes. So if you think about birds in your backyard, you know, or most birds actually have 4 toes. And in a lot of cases, they'll just have one that comes from goes backwards basically, and that helps them to perch and you know, do things like that. But piping plovers don't do a lot of perching. They don't perch on branches. They're just on the shore, and they actually spend a lot of time running. So having this tridactyl foot arrangement is sort of conducive or advantageous for that behavior. However, it's not going to help you differentiate it from other plovers because actually most plovers do have the tridactyl foot arrangement. So here's a couple of lookalikes that we often find that people mistake with piping plovers. Killdeer is on the left, and killdeer are really common. I'm going to go over killdeer second, but I'm just going to start off with the semi-palmated plover because they do look a lot more similar to piping plovers, but they are much more rare than killdeer. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of similarities between piping plovers and semi-palmated plovers. If you look at all of these, so they also have those sort of orangish legs. They have an orange bill with a black tip. They have a yellow eye ring, and they also have one band around their neck and that white belly. However, the differences are really helpful. So basically, where is the dark? So semi-palmated plovers have a really dark brown back and head, and then they do have a headband like the piping plovers, except theirs is much more accentuated. It's thicker, it goes down across their eye. It's more like a mask than a headband, and it also makes this really pronounced mustache that goes across their bill. Sometimes some piping plovers do have a small sort of mustache, but it's definitely not as prominent as in the semi-palmated plover. But the most helpful thing about semi-palmated plovers to differentiate them from piping plovers is their range. So here's the semi-palmated plover range. You can see that their breeding area is in that orangish color, and then their migration is the yellow. So they actually don't even breed in the prairies here. They breed much further north. So the only time that we'll be getting overlap is through migration periods. And then they're also not going to be displaying that nest defense behavior and more aggressive territoriality that we'll see with piping plovers and killdeer because they're not protecting nests here. Killdeer, on the other hand, do breed here. So they're a lot more common than semi-palmated plovers. We see them, you're almost guaranteed to see killdeer if you're out at, in the prairies in the summertime, or even just driving on a gravel road, actually. So they do breed in the Canadian prairies, and they will be displaying behavior, nest defense and other territorial behaviors. So you could, they do often get confused with piping plovers, even though they don't look all that similar. So we're lucky enough here to have a piping plover next to a killdeer, keeping in mind that the killdeer is a bit in the background, so it makes it look a little bit taller than it is in reality, but they do have a tall, sort of more slender appearance than the stocky look to the plover. And they are bigger. They're about 3 inches longer than piping plovers. So although they're not always standing side by side, it might be hard to tell the size difference. There are a lot of other differences that help you to differentiate a killdeer from a piping plover. So although they do have the white belly, killdeer have 2 black bands around their neck. So that is like one really, really good way to differentiate the two. Killdeer also have the headband, but again, more like the semi-palmated plover, there's a lot of dark on their head. So that headband actually extends through their eye and creates a prominent mustache as well, right above their bill. They also have a red eye ring. Again, the eye ring is kind of difficult sometimes to see, but especially if you have a picture of them, that would make it easier to see that. They also have a brown back as opposed to the more grayish back of a piping plover. And then their bill and their legs are different as well. So killdeer have a long, narrow bill compared to that stubby looking bill of the piping plover. And their legs aren't as, they're not bright orange like most piping plovers' legs are. So they're like more of a dull, buffy brown. Okay, and then so we'll get into some of the behavior that they show. So they do display similar behaviors. However, there are keys that you can look to when listening to their calls or watching them do certain displays that also help you differentiate them. So they both breed here. They're both going to be making alarm calls and showing nest defense, but piping plovers have a much nicer song. So their call is described as a peeplo. It sounds like they're saying peeplo, peeplo. And their Latin name, Charadrius melodus, actually relates to that. Melodus sort of stands for a tuneful, sweet sounding melody. Whereas killdeer, their call is described as them saying killdeer. So it sounds like killdeer, killdeer, killdeer. And then their Latin name, Charadrius vociferus, also relates to their call. So vociferus in Latin basically means conspicuously and offensively loud. So I'm going to play their call and hope that this works. So guard your ears because the killdeer is first. Skip a bit to the end where there's some more aggressive. Okay, so I actually couldn't hear that. I'm hoping that you guys could hear that. And now I'm going to play the piping plover call, and hopefully you can hear this as well. And just notice how much sweeter and cuter it sounds than the obnoxious, sounds coming from the killdeer. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that. I only got a little snippet, but once you learn to distinguish those calls, that's really helpful during the breeding season. So another behavior that both killdeer and piping plover display is called the broken wing display. So this is where they're, if a predator or a human is near their nest, they'll actually pretend to be injured and they'll feign that they have a broken wing, and there's a lot of flapping and tail flashing and sort of flopping around that happens to try and get your attention and lure the predator away from the nest. And then once you get far enough away, at some point they'll just fly away and feel like they've done a great job. So with the broken wing display, though, it's another really good way to differentiate them, even though they're doing the same behavior, because you'll see very obviously piping plovers there have a white bum patch, and killdeer have a really bright orange rust-colored bum patch. And so yeah, this is very obvious when they're doing the broken wing display, and it's another good way for killdeer to get the attention of a predator because they do a lot of flashing of that bum patch. So I'm going to show just a couple videos of piping plovers doing the broken wing display, but just in case they don't work, I just have some stills here. So you can see the really high stretching of the wing is sort of falling over onto the other wing. So it's really working hard to make you think that this is an injured bird. There's a lot of flapping and almost looking like it's falling over. So I'm going to try these videos and we'll see. And then here's just one more. And on this, this piping plover is kind of interesting too. If you take a look at that, it does have quite a little mustache there, but it's not as strong as the killdeer or the semi-palmated plover. Yeah, it's okay. So hopefully, you were able to see those and they weren't too choppy. But those are some really interesting behaviors that a lot of shorebirds will do to keep predators away from their nests, from finding their nests. So speaking of nests, here's some pictures of some piping plover nests. They're actually called a scrape. So what happens is the males will sort of lay down on their belly and kick out some sand and make a little divot in the beach. And then they'll fill it with rocks. So not like sticks or twigs or grass like other birds do. They actually make it right on the ground out of rocks. So they also will use shells, and other interesting things as well to create that little bowl called a scrape. Then the females, if they like the nest, they'll lay 4 eggs. It takes them about a week to lay the eggs. And an interesting thing about piping plovers is that the males also incubate the eggs. So the males and the females will incubate. And this is just sort of another thing that makes it more difficult to differentiate the sexes because they're both displaying the same incubation behavior as well. Whereas in a lot of other birds, it's just the females. So I guess I'll draw your attention to the loony here, just so you get an idea of the size of the egg. And the eggs always, they all have this pointed end, and the point is almost always inwards to the center of the nest. And if they roll, they're just going to end up staying within the nest. So that's a neat feature. I'll also show you here that there's some chicks down here, if you can see my pointer. So the chicks are actually born with down. They're precocial, and I'll talk about chicks on the next slide here. And keep in mind the loony size too. So these chicks are really small. They're like a cotton ball on toothpicks. They're very cute. And then I just wanted to show this picture here to show how easily camouflaged the nests are. So even though they're right on the beach, they're really, really hard to find. So here are some of those cute chicks I was just talking about. So yeah, the chicks are precocial. They're born feathered, and within hours of hatching, they can actually go and feed themselves. So the parents don't actually feed the chicks like they would in other species, but the chicks can't regulate their own temperatures. So they do spend a lot of time with the parents in the first little while, brooding and, letting the adults keep them warm. So there's a chick in every photo here, and they're, like I said, really well camouflaged, so they might be kind of hard to see, but you can just see how well they blend in there. And even this chick that's just totally blending in with its parent. And then the one being brooded there is so cute. All right, so yeah, we'll talk a bit about their habitat. So as I mentioned, they do require water within their habitat. So they prefer water bodies that have high water lines in the spring that recede slowly throughout the nesting season. They prefer sandy or gravelly beaches, and that really helps them to camouflage as well as to create that nest scrape using little pebbles. They also prefer a gradual beach. So something that goes basically from the vegetation line gradually to the water's edge. Nothing with like a steep drop off or something that, chicks maybe wouldn't be able to reach the water's edge. And then the things that they avoid is vegetation. So piping plovers are super picky about the beaches in most cases. So they'll withstand no more than 50% of a vegetation on a beach. And they also avoid heavy vegetation. So they'll only use the space between that, grass line to the water's edge. And they also avoid like a lot of shrubbery or trees that's on the edge of the beach because that's somewhere that predators can hide. So here's some images of some of the preferred habitat for piping plovers. As I mentioned, the gradual beach, the gravelly, sandy substrate, even big rocks and cobbles are okay, like you can see here, or on these ones, there are larger rocks as well. And then they also breed on alkali wetlands. So you can see this white crusty stuff here. So that's like a salty alkali wetland. And they use those often as well. But again, little to no vegetation is preferred, although they will use suboptimal habitats. So I actually put a picture here that I took this summer where piping plovers were nesting here. And you can see that it's quite saturated. And there's quite a lot of vegetation here. So although there is that substrate that they like, and there is some space for them, this wouldn't be like optimal habitat for piping plovers, but they were nesting there this year. Okay, so yeah, we'll talk a bit about their distribution. I did mention that they're endemic to North America, so this is the full range of piping plovers in the world. They're actually split up into two subspecies. So we have the interior subspecies, which is called Charadrius melotus circumcinctus, and they're the red and the pink. So the interior subspecies is actually split into two populations, the Great Plains population here in red, and the Great Lakes population here in pinkish purple. And then the other subspecies is the Atlantic coast subspecies, and that's called Charadrius melotus melotus. So you can see that those are the ones in yellow. So they breed on the Atlantic coast, and then they winter on the for just further south. So all the green triangles here is the wintering range, and the Great Plains populations winter in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'll go over a bit of the life cycle. So as I mentioned, Canadian piping plovers right now are enjoying balmy temperatures and snow-free beaches in Mexico, and I bet some of us are wishing we were there with them. But late March to early April, the adults are going to migrate north. And then in late April to mid-May is when the plovers arrive on the prairies, and the males begin to establish those territories. And they do a lot of cool behaviors as well to try to maintain their territory. So they'll do like certain flight displays. They also do displays to try and attract females, like butterfly displays, things like that. And then if they do catch, the attention of a lady who wants to stick around, the females will lay 4 eggs, as I mentioned, takes about a week, and then both parents will incubate the eggs in late May. In early June, the incubation continues. So this time period is important for census reasons as well, because the piping plover adults are going to have a high fidelity to their nest site. So they're going to be sort of stuck around that nest site. They're going to be protecting it. They'll be making a lot of displays that are going to be more eye-catching to a surveyor. And there's not going to be as much movement as there could be in other time periods. So of course, particularly during migration, we don't want to try and do a census and count all the birds while they're all flying south. So then the eggs hatch and the chicks leave the nest, as I mentioned, within hours of hatching, and both parents will brood the chicks, and that's mid to late June. And then the chicks start beginning to learn to fly, and they grow really fast to prepare for migration. And in August, the piping plovers begin migrating south. So by September, they're all gone and back to, balmy beaches. So now we'll move into just a brief history of piping plovers on the Canadian prairies. So the first breeding record was in 1892, and then in the 40s and after, there was a noticeable population decline. Um, it wasn't until 1978 they had their first assessment by COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and they were designated as a threatened species. And then in 1984, there was a survey of major breeding areas, and immediately after, they were upgraded to endangered. Shortly after the birds became listed as endangered by COSEWIC was the first international census. So it took place in 1991. And then just a couple important dates I'll mention is that in 2002, when the Species at Risk Act was enacted, and then at this point now, piping plovers are listed as an endangered species on Schedule 1 of the Species at Risk Act. In 2007, critical habitat was first designated, and then shortly following that, in 2008, the Plovers on Shore program at Nature Saskatchewan was initiated. And this program works with landholders, land managers, and people who have piping plovers adjacent to their properties in order to help monitor them and provide any sort of assistance that we can to mitigate threats to the species. So why census? Just because it's fun. Well, it's not always fun, but it's mostly fun. But so we census because it's really important to get an idea of population numbers. So we can get a more accurate idea of the population size as well as the trends. So whether or not the populations are increasing, decreasing, not changing. It also helps to identify potential threats. So not until you actually get out there and see the species and the habitat can you understand what's going on or try to understand what's going on with their habitat. And then censusing also helps measure recovery program successes and to come up with measures and plans to mitigate threats to the species and determine if we're hitting, the population sizes or ranges that are hoped for. And it also helps us understand site use, habitat availability, and locations on the landscape in order to identify and protect the habitat that the species needs for survival. And then lastly, censusing is a really good basis for stewardship. So if we get a better idea of where the piping plovers are, we can get a good idea of some rural landholders that might be interested in joining a program like Plovers on Shore and learning more information about species that they have on their properties. So for the International Piping Plover Census, this is a concerted effort that happened, as I mentioned, once every 5 years. And the first one was in 1991. And it's an effort across North America. So Canada, the United States, Mexico, and some Caribbean countries all participated in this international census. The breeding census was completed about June over a, say, 2 or so week period to try and capture the number of piping plovers on the breeding range. And then the winter census took place about January, February of the same year, again, to try and capture the total number of piping plovers while they're all in their wintering range. This actually makes it, since it's happened every 5 years since 1991, it was the longest survey for one particular species that crosses their entire global range. So it's pretty impressive, the effort that has been put into be doing this long-term census. But unfortunately, in 2021, the last international census was supposed to be completed in that year. And it was put on hiatus, of course, originally due to COVID-19. And then subsequently after that, there was funding issues and just some non-commitment from certain regions. And it's been kept on hiatus. So the last international piping plover census happened in 2016, and there hasn't been one since. So in partnership with Canadian Wildlife Service, Prairie Canada wants to keep that data coming. So we want to know what is the population doing, and we don't want to just let it sit and not know what's going on with piping plovers. So this data is really important, and we decided to do a Prairie Canada piping plover census. We used comparable methods, so the survey period was kept similar to that of the international census in order to compare it, but also because it has that overlap with the incubation period. The goal is the same, so to count all breeding pairs and unpaired adults. So the idea is that the census will capture the full number of piping plovers on the landscape, so every one of them in the population. And the goal, I should mention, of these censuses has never been to count nests, eggs, or chicks. They're recorded only as incidentals, and in fact, surveyors are actually discouraged from searching for nests, eggs, and chicks, just to minimize the disruption to the breeding territory. So across the prairies, basins are reevaluated every census year, and they're selected based on presence of piping plovers. So historically, and then reevaluated based on, say, information from things like eBird or the conservation data centers. And they're also based on potential habitat. So basins such as this, that look like they'd be ideal for piping plovers to nest there, would be included. All right, so yeah, so here's some results from the 2024 Prairie Canada Piping Plover Census. As I had mentioned before, we tried to choose a similar time period, so it was done from May 27th to June 16th. There were 176 surveyors, so there were so many partners and volunteers, and just so many people that played a huge part in this to undertake such a large survey. So it's really appreciated, all the effort that was put in to make it happen. 1,477 survey hours were put in, and 236 basins were surveyed. So you can see that a large majority of the basins were in Saskatchewan, 174, 54 basins in Alberta, and 8 in Manitoba. But I'll go over, the number of basins in a minute when we look at a map. 69 basins had piping plovers. 56 of those had pairs, so breeding attempts potentially. And then in total, 887 piping plovers were counted. So this map shows the locations where surveys were completed. The red dots are surveys where piping plovers were not found at a basin, and the stars are basins where piping plovers were found. So if you look at Manitoba, you can see they did 8 basins, but when you think about it, their basins were huge. So they had Lake Winnipeg, Lake Manitoba, and Lake Winnipegosis, just as examples. So they covered a lot of area. So although, they only have 8 basins, they really surveyed a lot of different sites along those basins to try and make sure that they were covering as much potential habitat as they could for the census. And then you'll also notice there's just 1 star in Manitoba. So let me go to, I'm going to show you a comparison of the International Piping Plover Census results. And then at the end, I have included the 2024 Prairie Canada Piping Plover Census. So for interest's sake, if you're curious, the world population of piping plovers is around 6,000 to 8,000. So as low as 5,400 and as high as over 8,000 during the International Piping Plover Census counts. The Canadian prairies, the highest number that we had was 1,700, and the lowest result from a census year was this year, so 887, unfortunately. And then another thing I'll just point out is that Saskatchewan makes up a large portion of the number of piping plovers. So we actually have more piping plovers in Saskatchewan than any other jurisdiction. And if you think of Saskatchewan in terms of the Great Plains, Saskatchewan makes up anywhere from 22 to 41% of the entire Great Plains population, so including the United States. So that's pretty neat. And Saskatchewan's really important for piping plovers, as are the other prairies as well, of course. So this sort of shows you a better idea of how the trend has been, bouncing around. So it was around 3,000, and this is the Northern Great Plains. And then there was a big jump. There was a big jump in the Canadian prairies as well, and then a big dip. But then there was a jump back up. And actually on the Canadian prairies, we haven't gone back up. So where are the birds here? This is the lowest number that we've had in the Canadian prairie since the beginning of censuses. So let's dig in a bit more. So this map shows the density of piping plovers across the Prairie provinces from the Prairie Canada Piping Plover Census last year. And this one's not presence absence, but it's based on the total number of adults that were found. So you can see here that there's a hot spot at the Saskatchewan-Alberta border that goes more into Alberta. There's another hotspot in Alberta here, and then there's sort of a really large population of piping plovers that crosses the Missouri-Coteau. And this is very similar to other census years where the Missouri-Coteau holds a large number of piping plovers. Okay, so let's look at each province separately now. So I'm going to start with Manitoba. In 1991, the first census year, Manitoba had 80 piping plovers, and then it's just steadily declined until 2011, where there was only 2, and then 2016 census had a similar result, and 2024 had a similar result. So they surveyed 8 basins. As I mentioned, when we were looking at the map, some of those basins are really large, so there was a large survey effort, but they've had this consistent decline. However, piping plovers are still present in Manitoba, and they are still breeding there. So the pair that they found actually had a nest, and it did have 4 eggs in it. So that's still good, but maybe there are piping plovers somewhere else that we're just missing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So if we look at Alberta, the number sort of goes up and down a bit, but this year's actually been the lowest result of any census year in Alberta so far. So 75 is how many were reported in Alberta. On 54 basins that they surveyed, they found 75 piping plovers on 11 basins. It is the lowest result of any census year. However, in Alberta, they actually survey annually. So they survey there for piping plovers every year, and this number is actually higher than last year's result, and it's even higher than the year before, which was the lowest count, which happened in 2022 of 50 piping plovers. So this is 50% more than 50, so that's good. And the other interesting thing is that these 11 basins that the plovers were found on they're a part of the approximately 25 basins that are surveyed every year in Alberta. So although they upped it up to 54, these basins were part of the ones that they do annually. So, they're definitely looking in the right spot. Another couple interesting tidbits is that about half of the piping plovers found in Alberta were only on 2 lakes, so Killarney Lake and Chain Lake 4. And then there was no plovers on 2 typically high count basins that they have in Alberta of Hand Hills and Muriel. And then one other really interesting thing, Killarney Lake just about doubled the number of piping plovers that were counted on that lake last year, whereas an adjacent lake called West Reflex had about half of the number of piping plovers. So it sort of leads to other questions about what's going on with the plovers. Are they sort of all moving to where conspecifics are? And the ephemeral nature of piping plover locations is quite an interesting question. So then if we look at Saskatchewan now, you can see that there's quite a bit of fluctuation where it's had a couple of high years, up to 1,400 birds. And then it's had a few or several low years where, 805, 771. And this year, 810 is actually higher than those other very similar results. So it's kind of on par with previous census results. But let's dig in a bit more to where we found those this year. So yeah, 91% of all of the piping plovers that were found during our Prairie Canada census were in Saskatchewan, and more than half, so 57% of all the piping plovers were on 4 basins only. So it's quite interesting. They were on Lake Diefenbaker, Chaplin Lake, Willow Bunch Lake, and Reed Lake. And Lake Diefenbaker, it's having another, or it had, I should say, another high year. So it's kind of been having really high piping plover results lately, and it contained 34% of all of the piping plovers counted during the census. So that's quite interesting. And I should mention too, Lake Diefenbaker is, it's a dam, so it's a flooded part of the South Sask River. So it's sort of an artificial situation, which the Water Security actually surveys that every year. And so we're really grateful to have had them provide us with all the information from Lake Diefenbaker for this survey. The other 3 lakes, Chaplin, Willow Bunch, and Reed Lake, They've always had piping plover results, but Chaplin Lake actually had its lowest result this year. It had about 91 piping plovers. At most, it's had up to like 350. So this is its lowest result for a census year. And then Willow Bunch was in between. It had about 66, and that was not higher nor lower than its, sort of max and min numbers that we've seen in the past. Whereas Reed Lake had almost double its previous high. So the highest it's ever had before was 21 plovers, and this year it had 40. So it was quite a jump at Reed Lake. We also found 8 new locations of piping plovers. So it added up to 21 adults. And I say new locations, these are basins that have either never been surveyed in a census year or had been surveyed in a census year, but no plovers were found. So that's really cool. And then just the last thing to mention that there were no birds again on typically higher count basins from past censuses. So Big Quill at its highest had 435 piping plovers on it. So that's just a ton of piping plovers. And then in 2011 and 2016, water levels were just too high there. All the habitat was gone and there were no plovers. And yet again, this year, there were no plovers on Big Quill. As well, Fife Lake and Redberry Lake, which have always had piping plover presence, had no birds. So yeah, questions that come up from the census numbers. There's a lot of questions and a lot of things that can be looked into. So first of all, where are the birds? When we have years that are consistently low, but other results are showing higher numbers in the Great Plains, are the birds just not making it here to Canada? Or, are we getting the whole picture? Are there some locations that maybe we're missing, areas just that aren't accessible or that haven't had any history of having piping plovers, that maybe, a large number of birds are sort of flocking to in certain years. As I mentioned, they have an ephemeral nature of where they breed, where there's kind of hot spots that blip on and off, and maybe we're missing one of those. Also, another question is that if a basin is suddenly unsuitable for piping plovers, for example, Quill Lake suddenly has no habitat because it's been flooded out, how long is that basin going to be avoided? Like once habitat becomes suitable again, do the piping plovers come back right away, or do they get used to avoiding it? And then also, are piping plovers going where other piping plovers are? So the fact that the numbers at West Reflex Lake, where there didn't seem to be any apparent, negative habitat characteristic, yet a whole bunch of them ended up, or probably not the same birds, but in a sense, ended up on Killarney Lake. So are they just finding that there are more plovers on a different basin and they end up, going where other conspecifics are? So yeah, now that I've discussed sort of some of the questions and some of the reasons why piping plovers might avoid certain spaces, let's talk a little bit about the threats to piping plovers. So I'll just end it with this. So first of all, too little water is a problem for piping plovers. You can see there's a picture of me on the bottom left of the screen. This is Big Muddy Lake. And, by the time we were there to survey it, in that survey window, there was no water. It was just unbelievable how much, it was just blowing sand and salt. So too little water is a problem. Too much water is a problem. So we have Quill Lakes here on the top pictures. So this is it in 2016, just totally flooded. And then this is Quill Lakes this year, where after all the flooding, there's just been so much debris left behind. And the same situation here at, I believe this is Muskegee Lake. So there's just a lot of debris and a lot of vegetation and not a lot of habitat. Another problem though, besides too much water or too little water, if you have really stable water levels and the water isn't coming up to sort of kill off some of that vegetation, we get a vegetation encroachment. And as I mentioned before, piping plovers can only withstand up to 50%, or they're only tolerate, I should say, about 50% of vegetation on a beach before it's unsuitable for them. Some other threats to piping plovers are predators. So predators are a pretty big threat, like coyotes, domestic dogs and cats, and a lot of birds. A lot of times it's humans that actually attract the predators through bringing in food or garbage or making trails and things like that. So human disturbance is a huge problem for piping plovers, both on their breeding ground and on the wintering grounds. So there's like hotel resorts, big, offshore wells, oil spills, that's happened in the past. Also beach raking, us just driving our ATVs, having a good time out on the beach. All of these things can be really disruptive to piping plovers during the breeding season of May and June. And as I mentioned before, the chicks require the parents to help regulate their temperatures, and any disruption or something that's causing them to leave the chicks or to leave the eggs can be detrimental to the nest success. And then also livestock. So livestock on the shorelines creates pugging and hummocking that can be detrimental to piping plovers. Sometimes their nests can be trampled, but also they leave deep hoof prints and big mounds if the shoreline is saturated. And these hoof prints can be so deep that they actually trap these tiny little chicks and they can't get out. So that's detrimental to the chicks as well. So what we do during the census is we actually record any potential threats within these threat categories. And then I tallied up the results. This is a really cumbersome table, but if we just look at the Prairie Canada results, we can see here that livestock was reported on 52% of the basins. However, I'll mention that because some basins are really big and they take multiple surveyors and potentially multiple days, threats are entered each time a survey is completed. So there can actually be a number of different threat entries for even one basin, like Lake Diefenbaker, for example, which is done over a long period of time by a lot of people. So if we look at all of the threat entries altogether, livestock made up a much smaller number, so 21% of the entries were livestock, and it was a bit on par with vegetation encroachment and predators. So all three of those made up a big percentage of the total threats. I'll also just point out, as another example, if you look at Manitoba, 50% of the basins in Manitoba had listed livestock as a potential threat. Whereas if we look at the number of entries, there was almost 200 entries of threats for Manitoba, and livestock was only 2%. So that's a pretty big difference. And after, talking with people from Manitoba, the surveyors, that's how they would describe it as well, that livestock isn't such an issue there, but more so it's human disturbance. So their predators, a third of the predators listed as threats in Manitoba were identified as dogs. All of the other category is just people. So really people and their dogs and their vehicles make up a lot more of the threats in Manitoba than livestock for sure. Oh yeah, and this is a nice little pie chart that just sort of breaks that down. So if we look at the percent of all threat entries, we see livestock, predators, and vegetation encroachment are the majority of the threat categories that were recorded during the census. Okay, so yeah, so there's a lot of threats to piping plovers. So and a lot of them really stem from human actions or human disturbance. So what kind of things can you do to help piping plovers? First and foremost, if we learn about piping plovers and share information, that's absolutely the best way to start helping any cause out there is to spread the word. You can also report sightings of piping plovers. Nature Saskatchewan has a hoot line, 1-800-667-HOOT, where you can call and report sightings of any species at risk. And now that you know how to identify a piping plover, you can report those to us too. Oh, a huge help that I didn't talk a lot about, but was a huge part of my job this summer, was getting permission to access the shorelines from land managers and landholders out there. So a big help in doing any sort of conservation work or environment work is being able to access the area. So although the shoreline is public or crown land, you need to cross over private property in order to get there. So it's really important. And we're really grateful for all the landowners that allowed us to cross their properties this summer. Keeping wetlands intact is another big one. So Quill Lakes, there was a lot of drainage, wetland drainage that really magnified all the flooding in that area. So keeping wetlands intact is really important for piping plovers and other species and our water quality as well. Pick up your garbage, keep dogs on a leash, do other things like avoiding nesting areas between May and June. And then also when it comes to livestock, grazing adjacent to the shoreline is great. Like livestock have actually positive and negative effects on piping plovers because they can create the low sparse vegetation that the piping plovers really prefer. So if you graze adjacent to the shoreline, that helps. But then if you can keep the cattle off the shoreline during the breeding period for sure, like at least until late summer or fall, when the beach isn't saturated and they're not going to have such a negative effect on the actual substrate, that would be great too, so to help us mitigate vegetation encroachment. And then if you're up for prescribed burning, if that's something you're into, doing that very early spring or late fall will also help to reduce vegetation encroachment. At Nature Saskatchewan with the Plovers on Shore program, we also have habitat enhancement projects. So if you have pasture next to a shoreline where there are piping plovers or potential, we have wildlife-friendly fencing and alternate water sources projects that will provide a 50-50 cost share up to a maximum depending on the project. So definitely reach out to us if you're interested in that. So for the future, of course, we're going to continue at Nature Sask. We'll continue to reach out through Plovers on Shore. In terms of censusing, we want to include Saskatchewan in annual surveys because it'll really help us to put a finger on sort of what the population is doing in those non-census years. And then we can compare it to the other jurisdictions that are surveying in non-census years. So even a subset of basins would be great. And then lastly, report banded plovers. I just want to quickly leave you off with this cute story that we actually found 5 banded plovers during the Prairie Canada census. Typically there's more, but there hasn't been a lot of banding programs happening in the last while. But one of the birds that was banded at Lake Diefenbaker, it was banded in 2012, and that's a picture that Evan Larson took in the top left. And so this bird is like at least 13 years old. It's just incredible. Their lifespan, I believe, is typically like 5 to 6 years. Of course, they can live longer, but like this is really cool. And then we had 2 birds that were banded in North Dakota in 2016, including this one here in the bottom left, which is also a really awesome picture by Evan Larson. And then this picture I took, which you can barely see the piping plover. There's so much alkali. But even a bad picture, you can zoom in and see that this band reads K99, so it's easy to report. And he was banded in Montana in 2014 and winters in North Padre, Texas. So we can look out for more banded birds as well. The USGS is going to start banding up again this summer. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all the partners and supporters and the countless volunteers and the landholders and everybody who made this project possible. We're just really grateful for all the work that the Water Security Agency does in counting all those piping plovers every year, and to Alberta and Manitoba for all the great support in coordinating their provincial surveys. And then, of course, financial support from Sask Energy and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Okay, so that's it. I went pretty long, but hopefully I have a bit of time for questions. I'll turn my video back on and I'll hand it over to you, Caitlin.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the really informative presentation. Very detailed, and it's amazing what you guys are doing. It's clearly a lot of work. And as you can imagine, we have lots of questions already from people. So I will try to kind of give them to you as we'll just go through as many as we can.
Okay, sounds good.
So May is wondering if piping plovers return to their place of birth. Is there some way of them migrating to new basins?
Yes. So actually, piping plover adults, I believe, show about a 50% fidelity to return to locations that they've nested before. It's less so to their natal site. So they're more likely to come back to somewhere that they've nested successfully, and less likely to go back to their nest that they were born,
Okay, perfect. And
hatched,
Laura,
whatever.
okay. Laura is wondering, the numbers are concerning from this past year. Is there any correlation with the high level of drainage that's occurring lately on agricultural lands in Saskatchewan?
So that's a tough one too, because there's been a lot of drainage, like since And a lot of flooding. So 2011 was a really wet year, like a significantly wet year, and the result was low, but similar to this year. And the interesting thing about what happened this year is that um, I can't really comment, I guess, about whether or not there's more or less drainage than has been in the past, say, 10 years. But the number of piping plovers result is the same, even though some of the basins do have more shoreline. So I showed the picture of Quill Lakes, which I'll remind you had like over 400 plovers when before a lot of the drainage happened and a lot of the flooding just inundated that area. Um, but yeah, there's shoreline now, but no plovers. So again, I
Mm.
maybe point to some of that debris and then also, sorry, one other quick thing about that. This year, a surprising result was actually how many basins had no water. So a lot in the south, in the Coteau, were totally dry. Like the Coteau lakes themselves, actually, East and West Coteau, big muddy. Horizon, there was a lot of lakes that had almost no water. So I can't really say for sure, but I know that altering wetlands does affect piping plovers, so we advocate against drainage.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Patricia is wondering, she says she's heard on Mural Lake that cabin owners are doing shoreline grooming to make the beach more desirable for use by people. Would this have an impact on plovers' nesting habitat?
Yeah, definitely it would. And did you say Muriel, like in Alberta?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So I know that Alberta has done a lot of work with landowners. I'm not sure about cabin owners, but I know they've done a lot of work with like land managers in fencing and in mitigating negative effects that humans are having, I think mostly in terms of livestock. But yeah, the landowners there have been great in allowing them to do the surveys. In terms of cabin owners, though, absolutely beach raking and manicuring and just being present is a problem.
Yeah.
Being present is disturbing, but beach raking is eliminating basically the nests. So
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's unfortunate.
yeah,
Um,
it is. But everybody likes to enjoy the shore, right?
yeah. Um, Maureen says, Lake Diefenbaker, the water doesn't come up until July. Is this still
Mhm.
desirable habitat?
Oh, such a good question. And Caitlin Luff from the Water Security Agency, I'm sure would have tons to say about it. What I can say is that Lake Diefenbaker is so interesting because we have flooded a portion of the South Sask River, and then we let it water rise in the summer when normally water goes down. And then in the winter, when we want power, we let the water down so that we can generate power for our homes and everything. And so it's the total opposite to what normally piping plovers need. And yeah, so I'll try and paint a picture where basically there's a ton of shoreline when they arrive in the spring, and then the shoreline starts disappearing as the water, like the dams are shut and the water starts to rise. So it's the opposite of what's typical where in any other basin, the water level starts high in the spring because of runoff and then it starts to go lower. So Lake Diefenbaker, the Water Security Agency actually um, will move nests. Like that's why they do spend so much effort in surveying because piping plovers are endangered, and that's a pretty big effect, basically flooding out, creating the situation where they think there's a ton of habitat and it's going to be so great, and then we flood all the nests. So they'll
Yeah.
actually move the nests back up the beach and they mark and monitor and put up nest exclosures to help keep predators out. And they do a lot of work there because it's such a unique situation to help the piping plovers at Lake Diefenbaker.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so
Uh,
interesting.
yeah. Anne is wondering if you ever use drones to pre-scout your shorelines, especially in places like Lake Winnipeg, which are so big, just to see which areas have changed since the last survey.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question too, and a big part of our discussion after this census. So, um, never drones. I don't know about Manitoba if they ever use drones, but I don't think so. But and Saskatchewan, Alberta, they have used like fixed wing aircraft. When the first survey happened, locations were scouted with an airplane, and then I think Alberta had like the latest that they used an airplane was in 2017. So it hasn't been done in a little while, and it hasn't been done with a drone, as far as I know. So that's something that we're suggesting that using drones for several reasons. It'll actually help us determine if the habitat is good at the moment. So not based on experience or past visuals, it's like right now, is there habitat there? Should we survey it? It'll also help us determine how to access the basins, because a lot of these basins are really remote or they're really huge. We don't know where we can drive in versus where we have to cross or what the best idea is. So drones would help with access. And then also, I'm losing my train of thought, but yeah, drones would be super helpful, and I think we should do it. Oh, I
Awesome.
remember. Sorry, I was also going to say satellite imagery. There's actually really, really high detailed satellite imagery these days that could also be very helpful in trying to determine potential locations.
Absolutely. That's amazing. How interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing more about that in the future.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Carol said that she noticed on one side that the bird had multiple bands on, including the upper part of the leg.
Yes.
Do these ever move and impact the leg joint?
I actually can't, I don't know about that. I can assume that they don't because they're an endangered species, and I can only assume
Mhm.
that only safe banding practices would be allowed on an endangered species. But yeah, what can I say? Yeah, they're light. They're very lightweight. The plastic is almost weightless, and then there's aluminum. The metal bands are aluminum, and those are typically, I think, Canadian Wildlife Service bands, whereas the flags or the color bands are from like a specific location. Like
Okay.
yellow flags, I think, are from the northern Prairie region of the United States, so that's how they can identify those. But yeah, I guess I'll just say I don't think they cause any injuries, or it wouldn't be allowed.
And Jazz is wondering how common is the broken wing act among
Mm.
plovers? She's heard of, or he or she's heard of other plover species doing this act in nature documentaries.
Yeah, and it's not just plovers actually. Like I saw an avocet do it.
Really?
Black-necked stilts will do it. Yeah. So it's really cool that it's several species shore. I've only seen shorebirds like ground nesting shorebirds do it.
Yeah.
But I have witnessed it in several other species. So I would assume that all plovers do it.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
It's my assumption. I don't know.
And Tori's wondering how sensitive are piping plovers to human presence? What distance do you try to maintain during your surveys?
So, I think 25 meters is in the guidelines. I can't quite recall, but we know that they are very sensitive to human disturbance. So, luckily, the locations that we're surveying, for the most part, like I guess we're serving all locations, but the majority of them are so remote that they're not getting any traffic from humans for the most part. It's just sort of those high use recreation sites or like Manitoba sites that get tourism all the time. But yeah, so we minimize the time spent in the breeding area to under 5 minutes for sure. And then, as I mentioned before, we highly discourage surveyors from searching for basically anything. So like don't look for nests, don't look for eggs, don't look for chicks, just if you notice the adults, when you see the adults, count them, determine if they're showing territorial behavior or non-territorial, or if there's one or four or whatever. And we don't even try to tell if they're male or female or anything. Just count them and walk away.
Yeah, right on. Well, that's kind of all the time we have, and thanks for staying a little longer and going over. We've had some really interesting questions that have come in here, and I just want to reiterate some of the positive feedback. Laura says, "Thanks, Ashley. Great presentation. Amazing work by yourself and Nature Saskatchewan." So I want to pass that on. Thank you so much for really the enthusiasm that you shared with us today. Um, the work that you guys are doing and excellent presentation. So thank you so much, Ashley.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for watching.
Absolutely. And thanks everyone for catching our live webinar today. If you know someone who would have loved this just as much as you have, feel free to send them the YouTube link, which will be available probably later today or tomorrow. And feel free to check out our other upcoming webinars and our YouTube channel for past webinars. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.